Hello, my name is Mary Beth Hines. I'm so excited to be the host of Keys for SLPs Learning from Legends series in honor of ASHA's 100th anniversary. Today, I am joined by a co host for this episode, Dr. Dakota Sharp, the host of On the Ear podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary Beth. This is going to be really exciting.
Well, I am so excited to be joining you on this. So, before we get started, just a reminder that this episode is available for Point One ASHA CEU. If you are joining us on a podcast platform and would like to earn ASHA CEUs, please complete all modules of this episode on your Speech Therapy PD account. And here are the financial and non financial disclosures. Mary Beth Hines, the host of Keys for SLP's podcast, receives compensation from Speech Therapy PD. Dr. Dakota Sharp is a paid employee of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is the host for On the Ear podcast. He receives compensation from Speech Therapy PD for hosting a podcast and for co hosting this episode. Dr. James Hall receives an honorarium from Speech Therapy PD for participating as a podcast guest.
All right. And I would love to introduce our two esteemed, prolific, we're doing a series called Legends, and I cannot think of two audiologists who more fit that title than these two. These bios are some of the most impressive and longest I've ever read in my podcasting career. So again, thank you both for joining me. I'll kick things off with Dr. Hall. Dr. James Hall, PhD, is an internationally recognized audiologist with more than 40 years of clinical, teaching, research, and administrative experience. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from American International College, his master's degree in speech pathology from Northwestern University, and his PhD in audiology from Baylor College of Medicine under the direction of James Jerger. You want to talk legends? How about like the father of all of it, right? During his career, Dr. Hall has held clinical and academic audiology positions at major medical centers. A founder of the American Academy of Audiology, Dr. Hall has held numerous leadership roles in the organization. Dr. Hall is the author of over 200 peer-reviewed publications, invited articles, and book chapters, plus 12 textbooks, 3 of which are sitting in my office right now. And Dr. Hall now holds academic appointments as professor part-time at Salus University and the University of Hawaii, a position as extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, along with other adjunct and visiting professor positions in the USA and abroad. Dr. Jack Katz, PhD, has been involved in the study of central auditory disorders for over 6 decades. He graduated from Brooklyn College in 1956 with a degree in speech pathology. He went on to receive a master's degree in speech pathology from Syracuse University. Dr. Katz began his doctorate in speech pathology, but made the wise choice of switching to audiology to work with Dr. Aubrey Epstein. He served as a Fulbright Hayes senior lecturer at Hacettepe, I'm thinking I'm getting that right, Hacettepe University in Ankara, Turkey?
Hacettepe.
Hacettepe, thank you so much. He founded the speech and hearing clinic at Menorah Medical Center and taught at the University of Buffalo for 28 years, as well as at the University of Kansas Medical School. Dr. Katz published the first edition of the Handbook of Clinical Audiology, a book that I guarantee every listener has on their desk, in 1972. After retiring, yeah, Mary Beth has hers. After retiring from his academic career, he opened up a private practice, Auditory Processing Service in Kansas City, which he has since retired from. Dr. Katz has edited the 6th and 7th editions of the Handbook of Clinical Audiology, 2 editions of Therapy for Auditory Processing Disorders, and contributed to numerous articles, research projects, and lectures. He also helped found the International Guild of Auditory Processing Specialists, also known as IGAPS. So, 2 very long, very impressive, very important contributors to the entire field. I truly can't thank both of you enough for joining. I'm excited to get to know a little bit about each of you, your careers, what still drives you to be such a, both of you are still contributing so much to the field, even after a historic, legacy of contributions. But to kick things off, Mary Beth, I think you have a question, maybe as like an outside perspective on all this, maybe to warm things up here.
Just to warm things up and make this a little bit of fun, because work has to be fun, right? So before we dive into the specifics of audiology, just for fun, can you tell us something about yourself that people may not know?
Jack, why don't you go first?
I was going to say, you go first.
Yeah.
They would not know that I was a learning disabled child and that I was left back in school and I was going to quit high school when I was 16 and had all kinds of speech, language, reading, all kinds of difficulties, and I never expected to go into college. Um, I actually got into college by several flukes, and things just gradually changed. And as we've talked before, my difficulties, my reading and spelling and all those. Now my wife has helped me, so but my reading um, and other difficulties make me a more critical reader. And so when I edit books or articles or whatever, I have difficulty reading very complex or sophisticated writing. And so when I edit, I make them into what would be more readable for me. And as I may have mentioned, people with learning problems or previous learning problems, or people in other countries or second language people benefit so much, and they say, "Oh, I can understand your books," and so anyway, I think I've said probably enough. Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Hall, how about you?
Well, back in when I was about 10, 11 years old, an uncle let me use his sailboat, and ever since I've been an avid sailor. And it has a connection to audiology because when I interviewed for a position at Baylor College of Medicine, you mentioned James Jerger already. I discovered he was an avid sailor, and we had that in common. And it might even have certainly helped me initially get a job because at least we had small. I had small talk with him, and then once I actually was a student, we'd go out sailing together. So that's my. I mean, some people know that it's not a big secret, but the average listener to this podcast probably wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, that's really exciting. That's actually a perfect transition too, because what I wanted to ask about is, with all of the contributions that you both have made to audiology, it's really interesting to think back of what was the initial interest for you in this field, knowing that some of the discoveries you've made and the contributions you've made have shaped what it is now. I'm so curious what was, early in your careers that led you down this auditory pathway. And it sounds like maybe a chance encounter with James Jerger might have kicked things off, but where did it go from there?
Well, actually, just before that, Dakota, I started out in speech pathology, as many people did. Jack will agree, and people our generation didn't just start out in audiology because nobody knew what the heck audiology was. I certainly didn't. And I took a intro to audiology course at Northwestern from Earl Harford, who was a good friend of James Jerger. And I was a speech pathology student on a full scholarship, so I had to remain in the closet there for a while. But I knew I wanted to be an audiologist,
Mhm.
and so I asked around. I said, if you want to be an audiologist, this was at Northwestern. Of course, Raymond Carhart was there. I could list all the greats. But I said, if I want to be an audiologist, where should I go for my CFY? And he said, well, there's only one place you should go. It's Methodist Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And so that's how I actually got into the field of audiology. I started working part time as a speech pathologist. I was working part time in the audiology clinic, and then there was no turning back. I
So you
decided
had
I
to kind
saw
of
the light.
sneak your way in there. I like it. I
Yeah,
like it.
but so it was always a chance encounter with audiology, whether somebody in the family had a hearing loss or maybe the person did, and that's why they realized, hey, wait a minute, there's this profession that's really exciting, and it was, of course, quite new at that point. So
Absolutely.
that's my story.
Jack, how about you? What led to the switch for you from speech pathology into audiology?
Now I'm going to go into that in my work, but uh, in those days, uh, things like auditory processing, it's before auditory processing, but things of that nature were not common in speech pathology. And so my professors gave me so much trouble when I wanted to do a PhD, my dissertation in phonemic synthesis. And so the professor said, well, write it up and put it on my desk. And so I did that. And 2 weeks later, I said, have you had a chance to read it? And he said, no. And I said, "Are you not interested?" He said, "What gave you the clue?" And and so and that got it started. And then he had me present to the speech department, the faculty, and I gave them what my idea was, and they criticized me so much. From It was just terrible, and so I went home and I told my wife, we're going to have to leave and go to another university because this is just awful. And so and then it occurred to me that I had such a wonderful audiology professor, maybe I could just switch over to audiology.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a
So,
great
and
story,
he
Jack.
was terrific. And what he what he was doing, I'm still working on it. All these years later, he was such a wonderful um, person and teacher. So anyway, that's my story.
That's really interesting. I think it's a great reminder to all of us who are, supervisors, who are professors, that, those moments with students that can change the entire trajectory of their careers. They're important. It's important we invest in those moments and care about the students we work with. I'm so glad it happened. I'm sad it happened for you, but I'm glad it happened because without it, we wouldn't have, such a legend among us in the world of audiology. But who knows what you would have been doing as a speech pathologist, right?
Exactly. Well, that just reminds me, thank you for your resilience. You
Yeah.
with the first question, you spoke about not even sure that you were going to finish high school and go on to college, and you were resilient then, and that early resiliency probably has helped you throughout your career, but especially during your graduate education.
Actually, it wasn't my resilience, but my father, who was a house painter, had a colleague who was a house painter. And when I told my father I was quitting school at 16, when I was allowed to quit, my father was so horrified. He had to quit school at 13 and he never got an education. He was horrified to hear that I was going to quit school because my brother was a genius. And so uh, when I said, well, there's no sense in me doing this, but he said, Mr. Cohen is here to speak to you. Mr. Cohen, his friend, is here to speak to me. What is he going to talk about? He said, I don't know. Talk to him. So he said, I understand you want to quit school and high school. I said, yes, I'm getting nowhere. And he said, you can't quit school. You have to graduate from high school. You have to graduate from high school. I said, and then he gave me his. I gave him his. After what seems like an hour, I said, this guy isn't going to leave me alone. So I said, okay, I won't quit school. I did him a big favor. Can you imagine what my life would have been if I left school with all those difficulties and no benefits? So, so that's just one of the things. My life has been full of those. And so I was just very, very fortunate. And so
Maybe we should thank the creative parenting of your father.
oh, wow. Well, and then, of course, my mother taught me that it's a sin to waste. Now she did go to high school, but she's not a good student. She too had similar problems to what I had, and so she said she was so smart and so she could figure out anything, any problem, and she said uh, that um, it's a sin to waste. And so that was one of the things I grew up with. So I don't waste electricity. I don't waste food.
Mhm.
I still do that. And then she said something else, and I'm trying to remember. when I was in college, I said, Mom, how could you possibly do so much? Upstairs, you have a 7-room apartment. You're you have a sick husband. You have a sick mother, and you have 2 slogs for children. And we just, when we got undressed, we just dropped our stuff on the floor. She washed the clothes on her knees in the bathtub and hung it out on the line. I can't tell you how much she did. And then she still, when she baked, she made something special that I like. Then there's a woman down the street who was sick, and she baked some stuff especially for her. And so she was such an education for me. And
Mhm.
both my parents were so kind and so. My father was brilliant, but he never went to school, and it was anyway not so good for him. That's.
Well, I'm curious,
I,
some of these early experiences.
by
Oh,
the
go ahead,
way,
Jack.
I have asthma, and it's been acting up on me, so I'm sorry about the coughing.
No problem at all. No problem at all. Well, it's I'm glad you shared some of those like early shaping experiences, because both of you have had a career that I guess you've really focused in on certain elements, or I guess areas of audiology that you've really become experts in. I mean, you have legitimate textbooks on some of these topics, right? But I'm curious what led to some of those early interests. Was that kind of the evolving, new interest in audiology at the time? Was it something about, so, Jay, for you, I think of my Handbook of Auditory Evoked Responses book, which I love, and I love doing ABRs and anything electrophys to this day because of what I learned in that book. But I know you've also you've done lots of work in tinnitus, and I know both of you have lots of background working with auditory processing disorders. So I guess we'll start with you, Jay. What was the early audiology interest, whether it was research or clinical specialty, that kind of pushed you forward, and then how did that really evolve over time?
Well, I was very fortunate to start out in audiology in the early 70s. And it wasn't, I didn't have any grand plan, and I was kind of just doing what everybody else was doing. But fortunately, because I ended up with James Jerger, he had a big rack of equipment that he'd been using for cortical auditory evoked responses in the 60s, right at the time when Robert Galambos discovered the ABR. And
Mm-hmm.
he, James Sturger and Robert Galambos were good buddies, and Galambos would come by the clinic. So I say we started performing ABRs before I really had finished my CFY. So nobody in the country really was doing it, and here we were. And the story was actually I was low on the totem pole. Deborah Hayes was the supervisor, my supervisor. So all I'd do is I'd roll the equipment in and get it set up. Everybody would do the ABR, and I'd then come in and clean things up. I could get a little more colorful about what I had to do there with children who didn't fall asleep and had sedation with suppositories, but we won't get into that. But at any rate,
Things
it
have
was
really
this.
changed over time. Things have really changed.
I like I say, I've worked my way up from the bottom, basically. So anyway, what happened was that this was right at the time where Marion Downs was saying we need to be screening all children. We need to identify children much earlier than we are, and I got a chance to actually see that, and I actually had evaluated with the other audiologists some of the kids that were reported in the cross-check principal article in
Mm-hmm.
1976. So I mean, the way I would explain it, if that didn't get you excited about audiology and wants you to do what you're doing, you should go into another field, because I
Mm-hmm.
was in a cutting edge before I even was an audiologist. And the other one good thing, and then I'll stop, is right away I realized there were some patient populations that just weren't being served, not just people who were impoverished or indigent, but also certain areas of audiology. Most audiologists weren't providing those services. One, of course, was auditory processing, and another was diagnosing hearing loss in infants with ABR and other techniques as they came along. So I decided, I don't want to just try to do what everybody else is doing. I'm going to carve out my niche where I'm helping a lot of people, and also, it'll be a lot easier for me because there won't be much competition. And then tinnitus, which you mentioned, in the mid to late 90s, there was more. fundamental research. We finally had some tools for management, and that was another good example of an underserved population. Well, it still is underserved, patients with tinnitus and hyperacusis. So I kind of followed where the opportunities were greatest, and that's worked out really well.
Awesome. Jack, how about you? What do you feel like was that early draw to audiology in terms of, and I know you've really established a legacy in auditory processing disorders, but what was that kind of early drive?
Well, the stimulus was Dr. Charles Mange, speech language pathologist. And he gave a lecture one day, and he stopped in the middle and he said, "You know, there's a skill that both children with articulation problems and reading problems have difficulty with this skill." Now, this was back in the 50s. I thought that reading was a vision problem and that articulation was lips and tongue stuff. I thought, what possible connection could there be? As soon as he finished his lecture, I dashed to his office. I said, "What is it that you were talking about?" And he pointed to the side of the room, and there was all this equipment that he had developed. And he said he took words apart and he changed them in different ways and way beyond anything I could understand. But he asked, because I was interested, he had me help him on one of his research projects. And unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to listen to his material. So I didn't have any idea what it was that he was doing. So when I finished my bachelor's degree, I was waiting to be drafted, and they didn't draft me. I asked the head of the department to get me a job. He got me a job in 3 central schools, and the first one had 17 children with articulation problems. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do what Dr. Mange was doing? Of course, there was no way in the world I could do what it was, but I thought, well, maybe I could just divide up the words into sounds and have the children put them together. and and so I made that little test, and the 17 children, 16 of them fell flat on their faces. They couldn't do it. One child just zipped right through it. She had an intradental S, uh, interdental S, and so I didn't realize. I know now she didn't have auditory processing problems. She had a motor issue or some other kind of an issue, not auditory processing. The other children had auditory processing issues. And so uh, I, I asked the reading specialist, would you test these 16 kids and see if they have reading problems? And so she said, sure. I gave her the list, and she said, I don't have to test them. They're all my children too.
Yeah.
Well, so that was that was the study. so then I thought, this is really, didn't know what I was testing. I had no idea what we were doing. The only thing I can think of is to turn the test around and make it into a therapy. And that's what I did. And dramatically, those children improved so quickly, I couldn't believe it. I don't know if you have time to hear this, but I went to the first grade teacher and I said, can I work with your children for, I don't remember, it was 15 or 20 minutes a week, and with this, and I was giving them auditory training in with phonemic synthesis and similar things. And at the end of the semester, I said, "Thank you so much. Next semester, I'm going to be working with the kindergartners." She said, "You're not going to be working with my children anymore?" I said, "No. Why do you say that?" So, oh, it was so important for them. And I didn't even listen to what she said, but she indicated all these things that the children had improved in.
Hmm.
And so when you say, how did I get into it? It was a speech pathologist who got me interested in it. And it was that group of people at, I won't mention the university, that wouldn't let me do a study in that field that got me out of it.
Mhm.
So
The invaluable connection between, that's why this one's being hosted by an SLP and an audiologist, right? Where even back
well,
at the beginning with Jack, it's always been intertwined, right?
thank goodness in those days people did not believe in auditory processing, and and well, of course there was no such thing as the auditory processing, but that concept. And
Mm-hmm.
so nowadays I know that they've changed their mind, because while one of the professors at that university said I was the worst student that that university ever had, um, when they had when they gave out awards, their first award in audiology, they gave it to me. So, I'm sure.
Beautiful full circle moment. Yeah, I love it.
I'm sure that they've changed their mind. Those guys were not. Yeah, I said it more than enough.
Well, I know, Jay, I know that you've also been interested in auditory processing disorders, and Jack, you mentioned the evolution of just kind of the general consensus on it over time. Jay, I'm curious what your perspective on that was over the years as it went from an unknown, you know, underdiagnosed, never diagnosed, disorder, to something that is established, to something that is debated, to something that is established again. I know it's really had its ebbs and flows.
Mhm.
What's been your perspective on that, Jay?
Well, in those early years in the 70s, fortunately, I was working in the clinic of James Jerger, and we were actually performing auditory processing assessments regularly. So again, it was one of those things that didn't seem unusual to me. In fact, I want to just tell a real quick story that involves Jack. In the background he just gave, I was still finishing up my speech pathology CFY, but I was so interested in audiology, I wanted to do some research. I was dying to do some writing, so I conducted two little studies: one of central auditory processing in stutterers, and another in a group of patients with well, then it was called spastic dysphonia, now spasmodic. And it was 1976. Jack will never remember this. And I was right in the midst of all this. And I went to my first ASHA meeting, and I was walking through a hotel lobby, and who did I see sitting there on a couch talking to somebody in the lobby but Jack Katz? And I walked up to him because I was using the SSW for both of these studies. And I said, "Oh my gosh, it's Jack Katz. I'll have an opportunity to ask him one of my questions." So I did. Now he could have just brushed me off, said, "I'm sorry, I'm too busy," but he sat down with me and talked for 5 or 10 minutes before we both took off and went to the sessions. And that's the kind of you were mentioning earlier, Dakota, about just taking a moment,
Mm-hmm.
and you can have an incredible impact on somebody's life, and you may not know it.
Yeah.
So anyway, when I finished up with my PhD, I knew that one of the services I wanted to provide was auditory processing disorders services, and it was a rough start. There were a lot of people who were quote unquote not believers. And it wasn't until the 1990s, with the decade of the brain, where the research on neuroscience began to support much of what Jack was doing and much of the research on APD, and that auditory training did work. Not only could we diagnose it, but we could actually do something about it.
Yeah.
And I've encountered people along the way who were kind of obstacles, but luckily I was a clinic director, so I could decide to whatever I wanted to do. And what Jack said about how quickly the children came around, I've discovered that over and over. If an audiologist wants to really impact someone and get quick results, I mean, we're talking, weeks and months, not years. Auditory processing disorders and good, intensive, appropriate management is going to give them that experience. So now, having gone through the decade of the brain and the neuroscience back behind or supporting APD, now we have clinical practice guidelines. We've got electrophysiologic confirmation of everything people were thinking before. We just need to get more audiologists to do it. It's kind of discouraging when I lecture on this how few audiologists are actually carving out that niche and that specialty. And there are so many children who just aren't learning to read and are struggling in school who could be helped by us, by audiologists, and working closely with speech pathologists. It's one of those areas where we have a great synergy, and we could be a real powerful team.
Why do you think that is? Why are so few people working in
A
that space?
couple reasons, Mary Beth, that I think are fundamental to the problem. Number one, it's not APD is not taught really well in school in AUD programs because I don't. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. There aren't people that are experts on faculty that know and have some experience and are comfortable, so they don't teach it, and therefore another generation of students doesn't get the background. And then there's a myth, and I won't go into this in great detail, but there's a myth that you can't make money, you can't bill, you can't get reimbursed. And I'll tell you, that is simply not true. Some of my best reimbursement were in a health science center, a medical center, were kids with APD. And once school systems are aware of how much you can help them, you can have contractual arrangements. So even in private practice, you could easily generate the revenue you need by providing these services. And it'll bring in other people. With adult populations, it'll bring in patients for hearing aids and other services. So it's a nut that needs to get cracked. We have clinical practice guidelines. I mean, it really should be a focus of the profession to rejuvenate interest and services in APD because they're so valuable.
Interesting. All right. Well, Dakota, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I don't think with those. Wait, actually, you know what? There's one more thing I wanted to ask, just because I don't know that I'll ever have you guys both here at the same time, especially with the two books that you guys wrote being such go-to guides for all of you know what I mean. You've written other books on very specific things, but both of your books, Handbook of Clinical Audiology, Jack, and Audiologist Desk Reference, Jay. So those are both two books ever. It's like you finish grad school, they're like, if you keep two books after this program, you got to keep these two, right? I'm curious because you've been editing them for so long. I'm sure APD is probably a big one, but what other big picture things have changed in, I guess, maybe using those books as a reference point? You're having to cover such a wide berth of topics. Which chapters have gotten longer over the years? Which chapters have gotten a little bit shorter? Which ones have gotten a lot more interest? Jack, we'll start with you. So with the Handbook of Clinical Audiology, what's evolved in that book over the decades you've been working on it?
I think you better start with James, because I'll have to think about that. So
Totally.
you want to know what? Say it again.
What's really evolved in the Handbook of Clinical Audiology? You know, which topics have had to get a lot juicier, and which ones have we not had to focus so much on over time?
Hmm.
You want to take it away, Jay?
Sure. Well, audiology is a dynamic profession, and maybe everybody would say that. I'm sure there's some professions that are more staid, but audiology is very dynamic. So over the course of a decade or 2 decades, some things become just so routine. There's not much. You don't really need to write too much about it. Other ideas never panned out, so those fade away. And then some are enduring. They become very, very important in day-to-day audiology. And so with the audiologist desk reference, which that was started kind of haphazardly. I was actually at a bar with Gus Mueller, which is probably hard for anybody to imagine if you know the two of us. But at any rate, we said, there are so many tidbits in audiology and this was before the internet, so you just had no way of finding it. He said, I remember that, but I can't quite get the specifics, so I can't teach it in a class or I can't mention it to my patients. So we were just looking for information that was valuable and important audiology, which was hard to find, and putting it all together. Some of we're actually I'm working with a few colleagues to come up with an e-version of that because that's been 30 years pretty much since those two ADR volumes, which of course are right behind me in my bookshelf, came out. And some of the we've been looking at the chapters. Some of them there's no need to do it. A lot of the early hearing aid work, the hearing aids are changed so much. Some of the chapters would have to be expanded dramatically. You mentioned tinnitus, for example, or disorders of sound tolerance, hyperacusis. And the electrophysiology keeps expanding, but in different ways. So My policy has always been to follow the research. And if you see what's really catching on in research now, you'll probably know what's going to be happening in the clinic 5 years from now. So that's kind of one way, kind of roadmap to follow what's important. Because if it's not evidence based, if it's not research based, we really shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, that's great. And those little tidbits, I can't tell you enough how much they've come in handy over my
Well,
career's I'm only 6 years in, but I'm still, that book is always on hand, always on the ready.
Well, we had a lot of fun with that, as you can gather. It was the publisher. They were desperate for the book. We were delayed in getting it to them by a couple of years, so they really couldn't be too critical once they got it. So we had a lot of little jokes in there, and some of the things are kind of the time has gone by, but some of them are still very useful. And you're right. I honestly still go to the ADR myself when I'm trying to come up with somebody's name or when they were born or some little fact that I need to have.
That's great. How about you, Jack? How has the Handbook of Clinical Audiology changed?
I really can't say. Either I don't remember, or when you get to be 600 years old, you,
Maybe
just,
a bit of an exaggeration.
So, but I can't think of I can't think of anything that can answer your question. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Can I jump in, Dakota? Because I've got a response that I think what Jack would like. One of my best friends and colleagues, Roger Ruth, he died, and I inherited. I helped clean out his study at that time, and I inherited his very first handbook. It was he was an Ohio State student, and I didn't have that handbook. It's right behind me here, and there were so many important chapters. There was one about the fickle finger of feigners, or something. It was about how if you watched a person who was malingering, watch their finger, you could tell a lot about how, whether they had a lot of laws, anyway. But some of those early, even though some of the chapters were never included in later editions of the handbook, they're very, very valuable. And I think it evolved. You found the best authors at the time for that edition, and it grew with the profession. I think that's a valuable contribution right there. So many people, that was the go-to book, the handbook. And the next generation, it was the go-to book as well, even though probably none of the authors, or very few of the authors, were the same. So it just had a life of its own, so to speak, and it kept growing with the profession.
Thank you so very much, James. Thank you. Yeah, I wish I could help, but
Well, thank you both. Okay, speaking of research, and we don't. I mean, this question could probably be answered in 6 hours. So just knowing we only have an hour, but can you share pivotal research that, in your view, has significantly impacted the field of audiology?
well,
I was thinking of that. Jack, do you have an answer?
well, I when I saw that question, I was thinking of. I wasn't sure, but I was thinking of my own research and the amazing difference it made with this one study that we're still working off all of these years later. And I was at Tulane Medical School, and I was able to, I applied for an NIH grant, and I didn't get it. And, but they people came and checked us out, and then they said we didn't get it. Somebody took me aside and said, "You're not going to get it this time, but you're just looking for temporal lobe problems, and if you would open it up to other issues, uh, you would get the NIH grant." He was pretty sure I would get it. So had I not done that, we would still be looking at temporal lobe. But now we have all these neurologists and ENTs, and they were all working together, and they were taking, I don't know, it's not X-rays, but whatever you call it. They did all kinds of studies. So I would tell them what I found, and then they would tell me what they see, and then eventually we were able to identify where people's brain lesions were, and then auditory. Then let's see, learning disabilities
Mm-hmm.
came along, and we couldn't use that stuff, but we correlated these new problems, and we saw what they showed on our map, and we start to realize that when you have reading problems or this problem, then this is where it is. So then we use that same data of those neurologists to figure out what was going on with these new tests. And now I have a guy who considers himself a competitor, and he's studying the Buffalo model, and I'm sure he wants to use what we found uh, and correlate it with his test to see what they tell us, because that study was so critical to my understanding and to a lot of other people's understanding of what our tests were telling us.
Amazing. I love that that was, I just have to have a little tiny plug. I love that that original work was done at Tulane University because that's my alma mater. So just have to squeeze that in there. So Dakota, are you familiar with that study?
I couldn't cite it off the top of my head, but I do remember, especially early on when we were learning about Jay. You mentioned too the cross-check principle and this concept of how different tests that we use all correlate to one another and helping us diagnose things. Jack, do you remember around when that was published?
I I don't remember, um, and the I don't know if we even wrote it up. I was trying to find my data, and but um, there was an article that I wrote with a neurologist, maybe, and somebody else, and it was in the '60s, and I'm sure that we went into that information, but I didn't actually present the data from that
Yeah,
for.
that's okay. And Jay, you had mentioned too that audiology is such a evolving field that I can only imagine, with even just the imaging we use nowadays, what more, with functional MRI, what other regions and things can we see in even more detail? I'm glad to hear you said you have a competitor looking into this more, and as it's like it's a competition, but it's honestly all going to be for the better, right? Whatever newer
Absolutely,
technology we have for imaging, hopefully that will have some more breakthroughs there.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How
Yeah.
about you, Jay? Any papers come to mind?
Well, one of the most, in terms of research, my whole focus has been on applied research and not so much experimental or animal research. But over the course of my career, one of the most incredible breakthroughs, I think, was something now we take for granted, and that is early identification, early diagnosis, and early intervention for infant hearing loss. And the fact that that even happened when it did is quite amazing, because there had to be a lot of research on the technology aspect of it, automated ABR devices, and did they work? And I was fortunate to be part of the clinical trials of the first automated ABR system in the mid 80s. And then along came OAEs. And so the automation of the technology had to be in place for universal newborn hearing screening. But then you also had to have a way to do something with the children that were identified with hearing loss. But around the same time, digital hearing aids and cochlear implant technology was just available. And so that answered that question. Then somebody had to prove that early diagnosis and early intervention made a difference. And that research also took place. So it was a coordinated effort, research on 3 or 4 different fronts, from the technology, where the engineers probably didn't know what the equipment was ever going to be used for, to people like Christy Yoshinagi-Tano. Of course, Marion Downs was cheering us all on. And then people who are experts in electrophysiology, experts in pediatric amplification and cochlear implants. One problem with audiology, and it happens with other professions, is there's a huge lag between the really good research ideas that are being reported in the literature and what's actually being done in the clinic. And we're still dealing with that. And so I would encourage any listener, any audiologist, to be very open to applying research findings in the clinic. Don't keep doing what you're doing, because we can always improve our clinical services.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice there. And I think that perspective you have from being in applied research, you've seen it firsthand when taking, whatever the newest up-to-date clinical practice is and integrating it into your practice. It's gonna make a big difference.
Big difference.
One of my favorite things when anytime I talk to researchers in my life, but especially I remember being in graduate school talking to professors on the things they were working on, I feel like they each had there was a framework. I want to say Dr. Brenda Riles used, where it's like, if you had an unlimited grant to answer this question that's been nagging you your whole career, this research question that it's still unanswered, and you want to pass that torch. You're like, I'm ready to retire, but this question needs to go answered. What is that big picture research question for you that either is murky or completely unanswered that you would just give anything to know?
Boy, I'm not sure. One area that's, I think, fascinating right now is the whole concept of comorbid conditions and lifestyle factors and how they influence hearing, and that I think most audiologists don't even think about them. But I think can we prevent hearing loss? Is it
Mm-hmm.
possible to prevent? That's the research question. How do we do that? And I think that question, there's enough evidence out there for us to um, actually make a big step forward clinically in answering that question. And audiologists could take on a whole new role, not waiting for somebody with a hearing loss to come into the office to fit them with a hearing aid, but take a kind of a public health preventive role. Say, how can we as audiologists apply our knowledge to make sure that the children now will never grow into adults with hearing loss, or young adults will grow to be older adults without any hearing loss. And that would have a huge impact on society and, of course, the individuals, and enormous financial impact. And that's a research question that I think that the basic research has been done. That could be answered now.
Yeah, now we got to take it to the applied side, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Very cool. Jack, how about you? Is there any big picture nagging research question that you still think about?
Well, it's a very narrow one, and it's one that I've had almost all of my career. I I tried to volunteer at a at a school, and that I would work with their children, um, first graders, for 30 minutes a week for a semester, to see the effect that it had on their reading and spelling and all their other things, because I was sure that early intervention um, would have huge effects, and it's never happened. And even though I volunteered, and uh, in the olden days, when people uh, thought that there was no such thing as auditory processing, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he said speech is just a mumble, and it's only because of our um, language, uh, innate language functions, that we're able to understand what people say. And so many people believe that not only in speech, but in reading. And so for 10 years um, in a school system, they stopped uh, doing um, phonics in, in school for reading children. The scores went down so low that immediately they changed it back to phonics. And I forget where I'm telling you that, but anyway, uh, the so this is something similar to that. Is that it bothers me that we don't know what kind of an effect it would have if you just spent a little bit of time with these children. And nowadays, the scores are going backwards, and I think you know that reading scores, and um, so wouldn't that be a great thing to do to see if they could figure out a way simple and see what benefit it would be for the children.
Yeah, that's a good research question that does feel tackleable, right? It feels like something that people could be working on, and would have a definite direct impact on spoken language or just speech and language development for kids. And it
Yes,
makes me think of more just kind of the big picture question of you both have seen audiology evolve in so many ways over your careers. And it's probably hard to have your crystal ball and predict where you see things changing and what evolves in the future. So if it's too much to say big picture, how do you see audiology changing in the future? Feel free to answer that question. Or even if it's more focused on kind of what your work has really specialized in, how you see that, you know, area, that specialty in audiology evolving over the next 5, 10, 50 years. Even if you can't predict it, what do you hope it looks like? I guess, how do you hope that things change?
I'm gonna ask James.
Okay. Well, if I could really hope for the best, it would be to harness automation so that audiologists weren't doing so many of the menial, tedious jobs, could focus on what only audiologists can do. So there are automated audiometers. Almost everything can be automated. We shouldn't be fearful of that. We can
Mm,
extend our reach so much greater if we have automation. I have no idea how AI will be applied to audiology, but I think with our guidance as the content experts, we could harness it to reach diagnoses much more accurately, much quicker, and with the ultimate benefit of not putting us out of business, but helping more patients. And I'm very much involved in international audiology because 90% of the world's population has no access to audiology.
mm,
So once we've worked this out, using automation, using AI to come up with the most efficient, effective audiological assessment and management possible, then we need to export this to places in the world where there are very few or no audiologists. So that's kind of my dream. And as you mentioned earlier, that it's doable. I mean, it sounds crazy,
yeah.
but it really is doable. It would be very inexpensive for someone to get quality hearing care. And of course, teleaudiology would fit into this because people like us could be guiding or being available for consultation and questions for somebody anywhere in the world. We're having this online, obviously, so it's um, that somebody's got to initiate that, and World Health Organization is quite supportive of that kind of concept.
Yeah. As a profession that's so intertwined with technology, I mean, it's literally at the heart of what we do every single day. Technology is involved. You're right that it's on us to kind of steward how all of these new technologies that are affecting everybody, not just us, but will affect us too. We need to be the stewards of what that looks like, and kind of have a
Absolutely.
seat at the table as soon as possible. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective on it, and I'm sure you probably saw how that went well at times over the course of the discipline, and at times where we missed the boat and somebody
Mhm.
else took off or took the reins with it. So I think that's really valuable insight. How about you, Jack?
I don't have any thought. My brain, if I ever had any thoughts about that, I don't. I don't have it anymore. Sorry.
No problem. No problem at all. We're getting close to the end of our time here. And for the show that I normally host, I normally end with kind of, there's a lot of students listen to this podcast. That's feedback I get a lot, or professors who use this as part of their curriculum sometimes. So a lot of students will reach out with feedback. And so this is a great opportunity to speak to kind of that new generation of uprising audiologists. If you have just, 1 to 2 minutes, piece of advice, something that's been pivotal in your career that you would share with those students.
Well, I'll jump in first then. Don't take a position, make a position. That's what I always tell my students. So, what do you want to do, and then go do it. Don't just settle for a position that's not satisfying to you, and be creative. There's almost no limit, and I learned this from James Durger, to what we can do as audiologists. We can have enormous impacts. We don't sell ourselves well enough. So go beyond just thinking about evaluating hearing and treating a hearing loss, and think about the whole person, because we can change lives, from identifying infants with hearing loss to working with an older adult who might have cognitive decline and nobody knows they also have auditory processing or hearing problems. Do use everything, all your skills as an audiologist, or at least attempt to, and not limit yourself.
I like that. Don't take a position, make a position.
Yeah.
That's right. Whatever you want it to be, go out and make it that.
Yeah.
And audiologists have done that in the area of private practice more and more, fortunately, where they've not just taken a job, but actually created their own company, perhaps, in their own clinic. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's oftentimes a bad habit of people in graduate programs to say, all right, there's a lot of different specialties in audiology. What do you want to focus on? What do you want to be your focus? And I think students can kind of get stuck in that sometimes and not realize you're going to take all of these things in whatever you're doing. So don't just silo yourself
Don't
into
limit
this.
yourself
And
initially.
you're right. You can create whatever it is you're doing. You might be the first one who integrates vestibular tinnitus therapy, and you know what I mean, that who knows what you can utilize those interests and create something new. So yeah, that feedback that advice is very, very good. So thanks for that.
Now, I would go along with what you have said, and what what I tell students is that be as broad as you possibly can. Learn about all these different things, and then as you start to see things that you like the most or you see are most beneficial, start to focus in on those and build up. And then, sure enough, all of that other stuff that you learned is going to help you with what you're doing now. So that would that was my advice long ago, and I still would go along with that.
I love it. I love it. I have time for one more question, and I would be so beside myself if I didn't ask this, because you've already shared how you both had a moment where you met each other, decades ago, that kind of has, I'm sure there's been chance encounters throughout your careers, but also I'm just curious if you could speak on, with, such historic careers, what has the value of other professionals, other audiologists, those like little friendships, those little moments with other people, what has the value of that been for you in your career? Whether it's someone you mentored or someone who mentored you, or just a friend that you get to see at a conference once a year, every couple years, how has that played a role in your career?
I can say that virtually all my good friends are audiologists. It's a wonderful profession. We're not a bunch of cutthroats. We all have personalities that are quite similar, and this is something that, unfortunately, with virtual meetings, is being lost. There's absolutely nothing like going to a meeting. The times I've walked through a AAA convention not knowing quite what I would do, and then by the end of the day, I've had 20 or 30 chance encounters, like you
Mm-hmm.
say. Some of them have led to research projects. Sometimes with students, it's led to changing their career entirely. So the personal, even though we are very technology focused, the personal part of it is so important. And that's not, that wouldn't be just limited to the United States. There are audiologists around the world
Yeah.
that we can interact with and collaborate with and inspire. And it's I'm still being mentored, and I'm of course a mentor for many. So that should never stop as long as an audiologist. Jack and I are good examples. We have a real bad habit of not retiring, and if you list all these people, death is what only finally gets us to quit audiology, and we go to that big sound booth in the sky.
The
But
big
otherwise, I mean, there's so many audiologists, my generation, and even and Jack's a little ahead of me in terms of age, who are still playing a role, and that's the way it should be, I think.
Yeah, we appreciate those contributions, all of them.
And Jack, you've mentored so many people.
Yes, I appreciate the fact that James is presenting, because my brain is not doing the job. I I'm so easily distracted, and and I so but the colleagues have been so critical in reporting what they found, uh, uh, telling about what studies that they have done, and things that they're interested in. And there's no question that when you get all of these brains working with you, that it's going to help you to go further. And there's no doubt that you put them together and the field moves on. And so, and I really enjoy listening to what you had to say, James.
Mhm.
And I I think it's a field that is going someplace, and it takes a lot of people with different ideas, and I think it's going to work just fine. So, thank you.
I agree, and we're only on that trajectory because of the foundations, that you two have laid so far for our discipline. I can't be more grateful for your time tonight, or all of the work you've done, the textbooks you've written, the ways you've helped me learn. Again, truly, I would not be an audiologist today if it wasn't for the work that both of you have done. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us. If people who were listening wanted to reach out or had any questions, would that be okay? And what would be the best way to reach you?
For me, it would be email. I've got several email addresses, whichever I think it's my Salas address. It's going to be on the that I've been using for this podcast. But yeah, I'm very responsive to emails, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can.
And and
I
for
also have a
me,
website that people can check out.
email is the best um, medium for me, because listening, and so it gives me time to think. And
Definitely.
but as long as it's short, I will be happy to try.
I think
So,
that's good advice for either of you. You're both very, very busy gentlemen, so we could definitely stick to that.
well, you guys are just wonderful, and I'm so grateful for what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it's so beneficial to the profession, and and for us to get a chance to express ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks for
Thank you.
coming, Jack.
Well, thank you for joining us. And it is such an honor for us to have the opportunity to speak with legends who have left such a legacy in the field of audiology and speech language pathology. We are two married professions, and I see that going forward as well.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. It's been an enjoyable hour
Yeah.
or time. I guess it'll be edited.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Dakota. It was fun. I think we met in passing at a convention at some point or saw each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's nice to see you in person.
I look forward to us doing this again sometime. Thanks.
That would be wonderful. Okay, so just a little housekeeping at the end. Again, just a reminder that this episode is available for point one ASHA CEUs. To earn ASHA CEUs, please complete all modules of this episode on your Speech Therapy PD account. And we would love to hear from you. So subscribe and leave a comment or review. Thank you.